Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, we're going to talk about prophets adding to the law. Did this go on in the Tanakh? We're going to talk about some of the criteria for prophets, and then we're going to move on to a specific example in the Tanakh, a possible issue that we'll look at. When we talk about prophets and we talk about adding to or taking away from the law, we can see readily in Deuteronomy 4:2 and Deuteronomy 12:32 that we are not allowed to add to the commands and we're not allowed to take away from the commands. And at the end of Deuteronomy 13:5, which is the passage that Deuteronomy 12:32 immediately goes into, we're talking about prophets and talking about, in this case, a false prophet. And what does he do according to Deuteronomy 13:5? He compels us from the way we were commanded to walk. In this case, one of the ways we were commanded to walk is according to Deuteronomy 4:2 and Deuteronomy 12:32. We're not supposed to add to the law, we're not supposed to take away from the law, so that we will do the actual commands. And so therefore, if a prophet comes along and adds to the law or takes away from the law and tells us to do likewise, he's compelling us from the way we are commanded to walk. So we are not supposed to listen to him. The thing is that in most cases, it's not so simple as just a prophet comes along and the prophet admits to being a false prophet, or the prophet admits to adding to the law or taking away from the law. Usually it's not super clear-cut. And to further complicate things, typically we don't operate just completely objectively and completely neutrally. We probably are going to be dealing with a prophet where we already have an inclination one way or the other. And it's not like we're entering into the situation completely neutral. Just as with most decisions that we make or most opinions that we have, a lot of times they come from personal inclinations rather than actual objective criteria. And so we'll have a good feeling or a bad feeling, or we'll want to believe, or we'll think that it has to be wrong for some reason. And then any logic that we use from that point, we may think is the logic that we used to come to that conclusion, but a lot of times it's just explaining away the decision that we already made. So we have to be careful of this, and we have to be careful of this in regard to testing the prophets, because if we're not doing that, we're not probably testing the prophet. Now, a lot of times when a prophet comes along and adds to the law or takes away from the law, usually, if they are not just forthright about it, they try to frame it as being okay. So they'll say that I'm restoring the true original way, for example, was one way to approach it. Or they might say that they are coming along to return to what God really wants, and we're just coming to this new way of doing what God really wanted all along, but it just wasn't the original revelation. This is just the new revelation of what he actually wanted and actually approved of from the beginning, and actually this was his plan all along. There are going to be different arguments that a prophet's going to use to justify this adding to the law or this taking away from the law. And they're going to be saying things like that the law is good and we establish the law, we don't take away from the law, probably right before they go about trying to persuade you to break it. And so regardless of their intent, regardless of how they try to frame what they're doing, we have to be cautious, because we need to be not adding to the law, not taking away from the law. And so before I get into this specific example, I want to mention that this prophet in question, this prophet in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament as some people call it, it is a prophet that people like to use to make arguments against Christian theology. He is a prophet that there is a particular passage that seems useful in arguing that we should be obeying the Torah. And so we might have some inclinations based upon that and based upon some other things that were said, that where we want to believe this prophet, we want to keep the prophet because of these ulterior motives. And so I encourage us to be cautious about that and to be try to be objective about the issue. So what we're going to talk about is the end of Ezekiel, starting from Ezekiel chapter 40 and onward to the end of the book. This whole passage talks about the creation of a temple, and it talks about new laws being made for the temple. It actually uses the word Toroth, being the plural of Torah, so laws, and it uses the word Torath, being a form of Torah. It actually says that these are laws that are being given. So there are new laws being given, and also talks about new hukoth and commandments being given as well. So that is kind of forthright and outright saying that these are laws. One example of this is in Ezekiel 43:11 through 12. It talks about Toroth and Torath. And the same goes on in Ezekiel 44, verse 5. So these passages clearly tell us that there are going to be Torah being added, essentially, in the process of creating this temple and all of this. It's not just a matter of reinstating things that were already commanded. It's a matter of new laws. And in Ezekiel 46:14, it talks about hukoth, new hukoth. It talks about a perpetual offering that's supposed to be made from that point forward every day. And this offering actually is different than the one that was already commanded in the law in Exodus 29:39 through 41, and also Numbers 28:3 through 8. And both of these passages command a perpetual daily offering, and this commandment in Ezekiel, and it does say it's a commandment, it uses the word hukoth. This commandment in Ezekiel changes the law that was already given. It changes the Torah. So we have several examples here of deliberately creating new Torah and deliberately changing the existing commands. So this definitely seems to be a problem by the standard of Deuteronomy 4:2 and Deuteronomy 12:32, based upon the Torah that we have. And so not only aside from those commandments, but also another issue is that it's creating this new holy place that's not according to the Torah. The actual commandments in the law tell us to create a specific holy place in the book of Exodus, and it talks about, in the rituals, talked about Leviticus, it talks about using that holy place and doing the rituals in accordance with it. So we're talking about a holy place that is different than the one in the Torah, and we're talking about changing the laws of the rituals, the commanded sacrifices in the Torah, and we're talking about creating new laws, and there's this new class of priest apparently that's being created as well, and talking about the prince according to Ezekiel. And if this prince is not a descendant of Aaron, then this is a problem as well. We have problems at the end of Ezekiel, and we need to keep in check our desire to preserve Ezekiel 18, for example. This is a passage that's popular to use in justifying the Torah and justifying seeking to go after the written commandments and seeking to follow God in that way rather than observing Christian theology. There are other passages we can use instead of that. So, for example, Deuteronomy 7:9 through 12, Deuteronomy 6:25, and also Deuteronomy 30:15 through 16. These are all passages, and there are more that we could be using instead of Ezekiel 18. Also, Ezekiel 36 and 37 talks about the restoration of Israel. We could be using Deuteronomy 31 through 10 to talk about the restoration of Israel if we wanted. So there's no reason that we have to use Ezekiel. We need to be skeptical of these prophets. Just because they were included in the canon, included in a Bible by someone at some point, it doesn't mean that they were tested. And just because we've kind of looked them over doesn't mean that we have tested them. We need to be cautious about these prophets, especially when we're talking about unverified prophets, prophets that are in books that are just traditionally accepted. We need to be cautious about them, and we need to be cautious that we're not allowing people to persuade us to add to the law or take away from the law. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like this video and share it if you think it could be useful and controversial and generate some new thought. And feel free to subscribe if you haven't already, so we can stay in touch and we can continue this conversation. Thanks for watching. Remember the commands. Peace.